The day the county condemned the cabin, the lawyer handed me the deed with one hand and an apology with the other. He said, "I'm sorry. I think they left you the worst of what they had." I didn't know it then, but those words would become the most ironic sentence anyone ever said to me. If stories about people who were left with nothing and found everything pull at something deep in you, subscribe. This one is going to stay with you. I want to start here because if I don't start here, you won't understand why any of it matters. I was living in my car. Not the kind of living in my car you hear about in motivational speeches, where someone parks outside a gym for 3 months before their big break. I mean really living in it. A 2003 Chevy Malibu with a cracked rear window, a heating system that worked maybe 40% of the time, and the back seat folded down so my daughter and I could sleep flat. She was 6. Her name is Rosie, and every night I tucked her in under a sleeping bag printed with cartoon horses. I told myself tomorrow was going to be different. Tomorrow came and went for 9 months like that. My name is Clara. I was 31 years old. I had $42 in a debit account, a job cleaning commercial offices from midnight to 5 a.m., and a divorce that had left me not just broke but invisible. The kind of invisible that comes when the person who was supposed to be your partner takes everything: the apartment, the savings account, the shared friends, the story of who you were, and leaves you standing in a parking lot holding a garbage bag of your daughter's clothes and a look on your face you don't recognize in mirrors. I'd grown up in the foster system, moved through 7 homes by the time I was 16, aged out at 18 with a bus pass, a backpack, and a caseworker who shook my hand at the door and said, "Good luck." I had no family to call, no safety net, no last name that meant anything to anyone. So when a letter arrived at the office where I cleaned, because that was the only stable address I had with a law firm's return label on it, I almost threw it away. I thought it was a debt notice. I stood under the fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning, mop in hand, and I read it. It said, "You are listed as the sole beneficiary of the estate of Edna Me Calloway, late of Greer County, West Virginia. The estate consists of approximately 4.2 acres of land and one structure, located at rural Route 9, Hollow Creek Road. The property has been condemned by the county. You are required to respond within 30 days regarding your intentions." I read it 3 times. I didn't know anyone named Edna Me Calloway. The lawyer's name was Gerald Huff. He had an office above a hardware store in a small town called Harlan Bend, about 4 hours south and east of where I was. When I called him, his voice was the voice of a man who had seen a lot of people come and go from inheritances they didn't understand. He told me that Edna Me Calloway had died 8 weeks earlier at age 83. She had no living children. She had been estranged from most of her extended family for decades. And somehow, through a chain of records that took him 2 months to untangle, she had listed me as her beneficiary. "Did you know her?" he asked. "No," I said. There was a pause. "Well," he said slowly, "the property is modest. There's a structure on it, but the county condemned it last spring. Roof damage, foundation issues. It would cost more to repair than it's worth. Most people in your situation would simply decline the inheritance and let the county take it." I looked at Rosie sleeping in the back seat of the Malibu. The cartoon horses on her sleeping bag were faded from washing in gas station bathrooms. "Most people in my situation," I said quietly, "don't have anything else." Harlan Bend was the kind of place that existed between the mountains and the rest of the world. Not quite committed to either. I drove there on a Tuesday in November with Rosie asleep beside me, and a gas tank I'd filled using the last of my emergency 20. The mountains arrived slowly, like a curtain being pulled across the horizon, and by the time I turned onto Hollow Creek Road, the trees were so dense on both sides that the afternoon light came through in pale broken columns. The cabin was at the end of a dirt track that had more grass growing through it than gravel. When I stopped the car and got out, the cold hit me like something personal. It was the kind of cold that comes from elevation and shadow, from air that has never been warm. I stood there and I looked at what Edna Mee Calloway had left me. It leaned. That was the first thing I noticed. Not collapsed, not fallen, but leaning like something that had been fighting gravity for decades and was tired. The front porch sagged in the middle. 2 of the 4 porch posts had cracked. The roof over the left side had partially caved, and through the hole I could see gray sky. Boards over 2 of the windows. Lichen growing up the stone foundation like green lace. A county condemnation notice was nailed to the door. Rosie stood beside me, holding my hand, looking up at it. She said, "Is this ours, Mama?" I said, "I think so." She said, "It looks sad." She was right. It looked profoundly, quietly sad. Like something that used to mean something to someone, and had been forgotten so completely that even the forgetting had been forgotten. I thought about turning around. I thought about it seriously, standing in that cold with the engine ticking behind me. Gerald Huff had already told me there was no money attached to the estate, no savings account, no hidden stocks. The woman had died with almost nothing except this land and this leaning, condemned, rotting cabin in the West Virginia mountains. But I looked at my daughter, and I thought, at least it has walls. I broke the condemnation seal that night. I know that sounds like something people with options don't do, but I want you to understand, I had none. The Malibu was 22 degrees after midnight. Rosie had started coughing, and there was a door in front of me that technically belonged to me. The inside smelled of old wood and something deeper, something I would later come to think of as the smell of decades, not rot exactly, but age. The particular closedness of a space that had been sealed against the world for too long. I found candles in a kitchen drawer. Old ones, the kind you buy at church sales. I lit 4 of them and set them on the kitchen table, and in that amber light the cabin looked almost beautiful, almost intentional. There was furniture. Old, solid, handmade furniture, the kind built from local wood by someone who knew what they were doing. A table, 4 chairs, a wood stove in the corner with a full rack of split logs beside it. A cast-iron pot on the stovetop, 2 cots in the back room, both with folded quilts on them that smelled of cedar. I got the wood stove going. It took me 40 minutes and 3 attempts, but eventually the fire caught and the small space began to warm. Rosie fell asleep with her cheek against one of the quilts. I sat at the table with a candle and looked at the room around me. Someone had lived here, I thought, really lived here. The quilts were worn but clean. The cedar chest in the corner was latched but not locked. There were hooks by the door where coats had hung, and the ghost of their shapes was still pressed into the wood. There was a shelf above the kitchen with 4 ceramic mugs arranged by size, the largest on the left, the smallest on the right. Someone had cared about this place. I wondered who. I wondered why they left it to me, and in that wondering I think the story really began. The first week was survival. That's the word that fits. Survival in the way that is not dramatic, but is utterly consuming. The kind where most of your mental energy goes to the next immediate physical problem. The roof on the left side let in wind and, on the 3rd night, rain. I covered it from inside with a tarp I found in the shed out back and weighted it with stones. The windows that weren't boarded had gaps in the frames I stuffed with strips of cloth torn from an old shirt. The porch I stayed off of entirely. One of the floorboards in the main room was soft and spongy in a way I didn't trust, so I put a wooden crate over it and walked around. I drove Rosie into Harlan Bend each morning for school. There was a K-8 there, and the principal, a woman named Mrs. Foss, had seen the paperwork for Rosie's emergency enrollment without comment. The way people in small places sometimes do, either from genuine kindness or from a long familiarity with hard circumstances. Either way, I was grateful. I cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, not because I had the energy for it, but because it was the only thing I could fully control. I swept a decade of dust from the floors. I scrubbed the kitchen walls, which were yellowed with old smoke and time. I organized the cedar chest, which held more quilts, some old newspapers from the 1970s, and a glass jar containing what appeared to be dried herbs. And on day 9, I found the first thing. I was on my hands and knees pulling a rusted kitchen radiator away from the wall to clean behind it. The kind of pointless but necessary cleaning you do when you're trying to feel some ownership over a place, and behind it, nailed to the wall about 6 inches from the floor, was an envelope. It was old. The paper had gone the yellow of old photographs, and the flap was sealed with something that had long since dried and cracked. On the front, in very small, precise handwriting, were 3 letters. CMF. I sat back on my heels and looked at those letters for a long time. CMF, my initials. Clara Me Foley. I had never changed my name from Foster. I had kept the last name the state gave me when I was 2 years old, and the record of my birth parents was sealed as a matter of policy. Clara Me Foley. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. Inside the envelope was a single folded piece of paper. The handwriting was the same, small, careful, slightly slanted to the left the way old women sometimes write. It read, "You will not understand yet why you are here. But you were always meant to come. Look beneath, not the floor you sleep on, beneath what was hidden to protect what was real. The well is not a well." I read it 4 times. Then I sat on the kitchen floor in the cold and did not move for a long time. The well is not a well. There was a well on the property. I had seen it the first day, stone-ringed, maybe 20 yards behind the cabin, covered with a wooden lid that had swollen and warped with moisture until it fit the opening like a cork. I had assumed it was dry or dangerous or both. I had not looked inside. If you've ever been the one they counted out, the one everyone passed over, the one someone said wasn't worth the trouble, this story is for you. Subscribe. These stories were made for people like us. I waited until daylight to go back to the well. Not out of fear exactly, or not only fear, but because something in me understood without quite articulating it, that whatever came next needed to be approached with clarity. It was a gray morning. The mountains were wrapped in low cloud, and the trees dripped with cold fog. I crossed the back field with a flashlight and a length of rope I'd found in the shed, and I stood over the well and put my hands on the warped wooden lid and pulled. It came loose with a sound like a held breath finally let go. I shone the flashlight down. The well was dry. That part was true, but it was not deep, maybe 12 feet. And at the bottom, visible in the beam of the flashlight, was not stone and sediment. There was a door. A wooden door, set flat into the floor of the well's base, with an iron ring handle and a padlock through a hasp. I stood there in the cold fog with my flashlight aimed down at a door at the bottom of a dry well, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like the world was about to change. I needed the key. I went back to the cabin and searched it the way you search a place when you finally understand it is hiding something. Methodically, completely, with a different quality of attention. I looked under every drawer, inside every jar, beneath every shelf. I felt along the tops of door frames. I opened the cedar chest again and took everything out, running my hands along the interior walls. I was about to give up when Rosie said from the doorway of the back room, "Mama, what's this?" She was holding a quilt, one I had unfolded and refolded before. But she had unfolded it further than I had, and worked loose a piece of the inner batting near the corner. And there, stitched into the hem with heavy thread that had been sewn specifically to hold it, was a small iron key. It was black with age, maybe 2 inches long, cold and dense in my palm. I looked at my daughter, who was looking at it with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old who doesn't yet know that some objects carry the weight of everything. "Good girl," I said. And my voice was not entirely steady. The lock was stiff. It took me 10 minutes crouched at the bottom of the well, with a flashlight between my teeth and cold water, seeping through my jeans from the damp stone floor. I worked the key in with both hands, turning it back and forth, feeling the tumblers resist and then, one by one, give. The lock opened. The door swung down on hinges that had been kept, impossibly, free of rust, oiled, I realized. Someone had oiled those hinges within the last few years. Below was a stone chamber. Old, hand-cut stone, roughly 8 feet square, and inside it, arranged with deliberate care on a wooden shelf that ran the full perimeter, were sealed metal boxes, 7 of them. Ammunition cans, military-grade, airtight, sealed with rubber gaskets and latched shut. I opened the first one. Documents, dozens of them, folded in wax paper to protect them from moisture. I lifted the top one and shone my light on it. It was a mineral rights deed, dated 1947, covering 4.2 acres of land in Greer County, West Virginia, and the subsurface rights to a depth unlimited, including all oil, gas, coal, mineral, and geologic formations therein, signed over to one Edna Me Calloway. My hands were shaking now. I opened the second box. More deeds, more documents, survey maps from the 1950s with hand-annotated notations in pencil, high methane, suspected coal formation. Shale depth marked. A letter from a geology consulting firm, 1962, addressed to someone named Howard Calloway, Edna's husband. I would later learn reading, based on our preliminary assessment. The subsurface profile of this parcel is consistent with formations that frequently accompany significant natural gas deposits. The third box held something different. Personal letters, bundled with kitchen twine, maybe 40 of them. I lifted the top one. The handwriting was the same as the note behind the radiator, Edna's. And this one began, "My dear Clara." I climbed out of that chamber with the letters under my arm and sat on the cold ground beside the well and read every single one. They had been written over decades. The earliest dated 1989, the most recent just 14 months ago. They were addressed to me, to a Clara who had not yet appeared, a Clara Edna had been looking for and preparing for and waiting for. They were written in the patient, unhurried voice of a woman who had no guarantee she would be heard but wrote anyway, because the truth required a witness even if that witness arrived late. The story they told was this: Edna Me Calloway had been born on this land. Her family had owned it for 3 generations, and the subsurface mineral rights with it, rights that were separately deeded and had never been sold, never been transferred. Because Edna's grandfather had been stubborn and rural and suspicious of industry, and had refused every offer that came. By the time Edna inherited the land, the natural gas industry in West Virginia had changed. The formations beneath this county were now understood to contain something of significant value. Companies had come. They had told Edna the land was worthless, the deeds invalid, the mineral rights abandoned. They had pressured her, threatened her with legal action, sent men in suits to her door. She had put the documents in the well. Her husband Howard had died of a heart attack in 1971, leaving her alone on this land with no children, no allies, and a group of energy company lawyers who made offers that grew more insistent every year. She had declined them all. She had protected the documents. And she had spent 20 years trying to find someone she could trust to leave them to, someone with no connection to the county. No known ties to the energy companies or the local families who worked for them. No one who could be pressured or bought. She had eventually found a record through a church charity organization she volunteered with. A record of a child, born in this county in 1992 to a woman named Mee Foley who had died of complications shortly after birth. The child had been placed in the state foster system and lost to records. The child's name was Clara Mee Foley. Edna had spent 11 years locating me. I want to tell you what I felt when I understood this. I want to tell you, but I don't think I can do it cleanly, because it wasn't one thing. It was many things collapsing into each other. It was grief and fury, and something that felt like being held by someone I had never met. It was the sensation of a wound I had carried for 31 years, the wound of being a person nobody chose, nobody came back for. Nobody left anything for, suddenly filling with something warm and complicated and real. Edna Mee Calloway was not my grandmother, not by blood. She was a woman who had known my mother briefly through that charity organization. A woman who had been at the hospital when my mother died and had held the record of it in her mind for decades. A woman who had decided, in the absence of family, in the absence of obligation, in the absence of any reason except basic human decency, that someone should remember, that someone should receive what was theirs. I almost didn't fight for it. I need to tell you this because it matters. There was a period, 3 weeks after I found the documents, after I had driven into Harlan Bend and sat across from Gerald Huff with the boxes on his desk and watched his face go through several complicated transformations, when I almost stopped. The energy company's lawyers arrived within days of Gerald filing the mineral rights claim. There were 3 of them. They were polite in the way that carries a threat inside the politeness, like a stone inside a soft fruit. They told me the documents were of uncertain legal standing. They told me the deeds predated current subsurface rights law. They told me that pursuing this claim would be expensive, lengthy, and, in their professional assessment, unlikely to succeed. One of them, a man with a very calm voice, said, "Ms. Foley, you should consider what's reasonable given your circumstances." My circumstances. I sat in that office in the same coat I'd been wearing for 2 years, and I thought about my circumstances, about the Malibu, about Rosie's cartoon horse sleeping bag, about the $42, about every door that had been closed in my face by people who had assessed my circumstances and found me wanting. I almost folded. I went back to the cabin that night and I sat at the table Edna had sat at, and I held the letters and I read the last one again, the one dated 14 months before she died. It ended, "I don't know if you are brave yet. You may not need to be. But if you are, don't let them take what was always yours. They have always counted on people like us to believe we don't deserve what we have. Don't believe them." I put the letter down. I called Gerald Huff. I said, "We're going to fight." What followed was not swift or clean or cinematic in the way that movies make things look. It was 14 months of legal proceedings, depositions, land surveys, geological assessments, and documents I barely understood being explained to me by a geology expert Gerald brought in from Morgantown. It was sitting in hearing rooms in county courthouses, while men in good suits used language designed to make me feel small. It was Rosie asking me why I looked tired and telling her that I was working on something important. It was also, slowly, irrevocably, and with a momentum I had not expected, working. Because Edna had been meticulous. Edna had spent decades protecting those documents for exactly this reason. Every deed was valid. Every signature was authentic. Every geological notation was consistent with what current surveys confirmed was beneath that land, a natural gas deposit of significant size, overlapping with a methane formation that the energy company had already begun developing on adjacent parcels, parcels that technically crossed the subsurface boundary into Edna's land. Our land, the final assessment when it came, was a number I read 3 times before I believed it. The subsurface mineral rights, the undeveloped formations. The royalty value of what lay beneath those 4.2 acres and the adjacent formations that crossed the boundary were assessed at a conservatively estimated $207 million. I was sitting in Gerald Huff's office when he told me. Rosie was with me. She was 7 by then, her hair in 2 braids, wearing a coat that actually fit her. Because by that point we were no longer in the cabin, we had moved into a rental in Harlan Bend while the case resolved, and for the first time in 2 years, she had her own bedroom. When Gerald said the number, I didn't speak. Rosie looked up from the book she was reading and said, "Mama." "Are you crying?" I said. "A little," she said. "Is it good crying or sad crying?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "It's both, baby, it's both. I want to tell you what I did first. Not with the money, that came later, slowly, carefully. With lawyers and financial advisors, and a trust established in Rosie's name and donations to the foster care advocacy organization I had found 3 years earlier and never had anything to give. What I did first was go back to the cabin. It was spring by then, May. The mountains had gone green in that particular West Virginia way, not the manicured green of parks but the deep, complicated green of places that have been growing without permission for a very long time. The porch had been repaired, the roof was whole, the windows were clear. I went inside. I made coffee in a ceramic mug, the smallest one from the shelf where Edna had arranged them by size. I sat at the table and I held the last letter and I read it one more time, and I spoke to her. I know that may sound like something it isn't. But I sat in the cabin she had lived in for 60 years, in the mountains she had refused to abandon, at the table where she had written 40 letters to a woman she had never met, and I said, "I found it." And I didn't let them take it. The cabin didn't answer. The mountains didn't answer. But the silence that came back felt full rather than empty. The way silence sometimes does when you're in a place that has been well loved. The energy company settled. I won't say what the final terms were because the settlement agreement has a confidentiality clause, which Gerald tells me is standard. What I will say is that the number was not smaller than what the assessment said. I used some of it to buy the cabin outright, remove it from any legal ambiguity, repair it fully, restore it to something close to what it might have been when Edna was young, and the mountains were her entire world. I put a marker at the edge of the property, a stone one. It reads, Edna Me Calloway. She protected what was real. 1940-2023. It's not a grave, it's a witness mark. She deserved one. Rosie asked me once, not long after everything resolved, what I thought would have happened if we hadn't gone to the cabin. If I had declined the inheritance the way Gerald Huff suggested might be reasonable. I thought about it for a while. I said we'd still be sleeping in the car, she said, but then we'd never have found the door in the well. I said, no, we wouldn't. She was quiet for a moment. Then I think Edna knew you'd come. I think Edna knew too. There's something I've thought about a great deal in the time since, something I can't quite let go of. The energy company's lawyers, those careful, polite men with their implications about my circumstances, they weren't entirely wrong that the case was difficult. It was. And they weren't wrong that many people in my situation would have walked away. Many would have, most probably, but here is what they miscalculated. They assumed that a person with nothing has nothing to lose. They forgot that a person with nothing sometimes has nothing left to be afraid of. I had slept in a car for 9 months. I had cleaned office buildings at 3 in the morning. I had raised my daughter in a condemned cabin with a tarp over the roof and a wood stove as our only heat. I had already survived things those men in their good suits could not have survived. They brought legal pressure to bear on someone who had already been pressed to the floor and gotten back up. And the thing about someone who has already lost everything, truly lost it, slept in it, eaten around it, dressed their child in spite of it, is that they are not afraid of losing. They are afraid of not trying. I'm not the same woman who drove down Hollow Creek Road in November with $42 and a daughter in a cartoon horse sleeping bag. I know that. And I know too that the change is not simply the money, though the money is real and I will not pretend otherwise, because pretending would be an insult to what that money means to Rosie's life, to what it means that she will not age out of anything, will not start her adult life with a bus pass and a handshake. The change is something else, something harder to name. It is the knowledge, the bone-deep lived knowledge, that the thing people dismiss most readily is sometimes the thing that was most carefully protected. That what looks like nothing can be the container for everything. That the person they hand the worst of what remains to, the leftover, the condemned, the leaning and cracked and barely standing, that person may be exactly the person it was always meant for. Edna knew that. She spent 40 years waiting to be sure I'd come. I came. The last time I drove down Hollow Creek Road, it was autumn. The maples had gone gold, and the light through them was the color of old honey. Rosie was asleep in the back seat, 8 years old now, in a coat that fit her, under a blanket I'd bought at a store like a normal person. I parked in front of the cabin and sat for a while with the engine off. The cabin looked solid, quiet. The stone marker at the edge of the field caught the last of the afternoon light. I thought about a lawyer handing me a deed with an apology, about a note behind a radiator with my initials on it, about a door at the bottom of a dry well, about 40 letters written to someone who hadn't arrived yet. I thought about a woman who refused to sell, who put everything underground to protect it, who found a child she had never met in the records of a charity organization, and decided, for reasons I may never fully understand, that this child deserved to inherit something real. The mountains were quiet around me. The cabin held its shape against the sky. I thought they told me it was the worst of what they had, and I thought, she always knew it was the best. If stories about people who were written off and found their way back to something real stay with you after the screen goes dark, subscribe. The next one is already waiting.